So this is Kevin Gaw on Friday, December 4th at 12:21 p.m. with Dr. Beatrice Golomb also on the line, and it is my pleasure to interview Jim Binns for the Goal 4 Legacy Project. So, Jim, welcome here today.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And so, I guess to begin, do you mind just telling us about your background before your involvement in Goal 4 illness?
Well, I guess first and foremost, I was a veteran. Was in Army ROTC during college and graduated in 1967. Spent 2 years in the Army, including a year in Vietnam as a member of a MACV Province Advisory Committee. I got out of the Army, went to law school, practiced law for 1 year, and joined a small startup company as its third employee. Um, the company was developing a prototype of a real-time ultrasound scanner, and we had the good fortune to be the pioneers in developing real-time ultrasound for use in obstetrics. Um, the I became president after a few years, and had the good fortune of working with and knowing a lot of the doctors and scientists who were working on obstetrical research at that time, as well as developing new products and improving the product that we developed. Um, my partners, the guys who founded that business, subsequently sold it to a large pharmaceutical company. Uh, I later started a second company in the same industry with one of the engineers who worked at the first one. That company was eventually bought by another large medical imaging company. And in between, I worked at the Department of Defense as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of International Security Policy during the tail end of the Reagan administration. So that was my background before I got involved with Gulf War.
And in terms of how you became involved with Goal 4 illness, when and how did that occur?
Well, the first first event I attended that related to Gulf War illness was where I met you, Beatrice. The CDC conference, I think it was in 1999. Um, it, I believe, was one of the requirements of the statute that also created the Research Advisory Committee. And do you remember? Was it 2 days long? And,
That sounds about right. I don't
yeah,
remember exactly.
it was in Atlanta, I remember, and they brought in all of the people who were uh, working on, or in retrospect, working against um, finding out what had gone on, happened to the veterans. Um, the reason I was there is that one of um, one of my daughters had developed an illness after being exposed to a heavy dose of pesticides in Africa. And for a couple of years, we didn't know what had happened to her. Um, she had symptoms she'd never had before, and my wife happened to see a broadcast of a program by Bill Moyers on the work that Robert Haley had done on it was the original studies that he did with Ross Perot's financing, showing that Gulf War illness was real and so on. And my wife saw the symptoms and said, "Gee, these are the same symptoms that Alexa has." And we began to look at the possibility that it might have been the pesticides that we were exposed to on that trip. And I ended up talking to Robert and becoming interested in what he was doing, and interested in learning more about it, obviously. Um, and at that conference, I really had not followed the Gulf War issue up until then, and I was I was really shocked to find government officials and government uh, scientists, supposedly some of them, uh, treating the veterans the way we had seen doctors treat our daughter. And namely, if they couldn't find something in their normal test that explained the problem, their immediate response was, "Well, this must be psychological. This must be psychosomatic." It's not that we don't know what's going on. It's that this individual is imagining it. And some of these veterans were in wheelchairs. I mean, I was really shocked to find the attitude that was obviously the primary attitude of the government. And uh, having worked in the Defense Department, having been in the military myself, I always assumed that veterans were going to be treated well if you became a veteran and needed help, and that clearly wasn't the case here.
Yeah, and so why did you agree to be involved? Or that is, what stimulated your interest in Gulf War illness?
Well, I spoke with a number of scientists at that meeting, including Dr. Golomb. I and Naturally, I was hopeful that their work could lead to a treatment that would be effective against this problem, since it could help. If it could help Gulf War veterans, it would quite possibly help my daughter as well. And so I began to um, take a closer interest in the research that was going on, and also in the attitudes in Washington. And after the 2000 election, um, uh, the person who had been my boss at the Pentagon, whose name was Ron Lehman, Ron had been Assistant Secretary for International Security Policy. And he and I became good friends during the time I worked for him. And we would exchange family information as well. And he he uh, he discovered that one of his other old work colleagues was going to be Secretary of Veterans Affairs. That was Tony Principi. And so he said he would speak to Tony Principi about Gulf War illness. And when he did, he discovered that Principi said, "Well, I have a committee to appoint." And this was the Research Advisory Committee, which had been mandated by Congress in 1998, but which the Clinton administration had never acted to appoint. And so Ron told um, Tony about me, and I had an interview with Tony. I told him all about my daughter, but I assured him that I was also very interested in helping the veterans, and he gave me the job.
So what were the early attitudes like towards Gulf War illness?
Well, as I said, I was shocked to determine, although it was a matter of public record, and subsequently I've had lots of reasons and time to look back at what was being said in the 1990s. Um, and I'm sure you've heard this from other veterans themselves who were much closer to it at that point than I ever was. That the the attitude of the Department of Defense and the Department of Veterans Affairs was that nothing strange, nothing different had happened to the veterans who came home ill. That this was just what happened after every war. And the first person to there were a handful of people, uh, Dr. Golomb being one of them, Dr. Haley certainly being the one who was most uh, most in the press and who was the first one to get widespread coverage for what he was doing. But there were a handful of other scientists who were working to try to discover honestly what was happening. Uh, Dr. Steele, Dr. Lee Steele, Dr. Roberta White, but the the public attitudes of the government until 2000, after the 2000 election, never wavered. They would just they had to acknowledge periodically that what they were saying was, they said that there had been no exposure, for example, of veterans to nerve agents. Well, then I gather on the eve of the a congressional hearing that was going to show videos of the destruction of the ammo dumps at Camisea and the release of tons of munitions into the air. Uh, the the government acknowledged that there had been an event there involving storage of large numbers of chemical weapons. But this was all before I got involved, so I'm really a secondhand resource of that. But I guess what I did discover, I thought that when I was appointed and the committee was appointed, and I did get to have some say in the people on the committee. Um, because Tony Principi was a good man. He wanted to find out what was wrong, and he wanted to help the veterans who were ill. So he and secondly, the reason this committee was appointed when it hadn't been appointed by the previous administration was that this was very important to Ross Perot. And if you'll recall, Ross Perot played a critical role in the election of George W. Bush in 2000. In 1992 and 1996, Ross Perot had run he had run as an independent candidate. And it's widely assumed that the reason that George H.W. Bush lost the 1992 election was that Ross Perot took more votes away from him than he did from Bill Clinton. So when Ross Perot endorsed George W. Bush in 2000, that was a huge benefit to future President George W. Bush. And the only thing I am told, this was again before I got directly involved, but I was told that the one thing that Ross Perot asked George W. Bush that he wanted the Research Advisory Committee appointed. He had always been a great friend of veterans, and this is what Ross Perot wanted. So you had Ross Perot, you had George, the president, the new president, you had the new Secretary of Veterans Affairs. All of these people prepared to support honest research into helping Gulf War veterans. And I knew from having met people like Dr. Golomb at the conference that while there weren't many scientists who were working on this, the ones who were very, distinguished scientists, and they were making progress. And so I naively thought that this was going to be quite a positive experience. The government was ready to change. You had good science on your side, and that we really could make some immediate progress. But that didn't prove to be the case.
And regarding those adverse attitudes, how do you think, or how did those seem to make the veterans feel?
Well, as I said, the the veterans, as I got to know them at first at that conference in Atlanta, And then subsequently, there were veterans on the research advisory committee. That was one of its strengths. It wasn't just scientists and doctors. There were, I think, four veterans, perhaps five on the first uh, out of maybe 15 members. So I got to know veterans' attitudes very early on, and some of these people had been uh, active in trying to get the government to change its position and recognize the health issues they were facing from the month they got back, uh, and it was very frustrating to them. They, I, I, I was always, um, I was always quite. I suppose most of the veterans who had given up just did that. They just, um, eventually felt the government was not going to help them, and they went on with their lives as best they could. Um, the ones who stayed involved were the real heroes here. Um, to when you've served your country and you're, most of these people were not officers. They were some of the women were officers, but most of the real active participants in the veteran movement were had been enlisted, and they get some of them went to college when they get back and so on. But they were not senior figures in the military, and yet they became extremely effective at working with Congress, at working with the media, at understanding science, at everything they needed to know to keep this issue from being buried, which it otherwise would have been.
And do you have any insights or thoughts into the origins of these adverse attitudes?
I I understand what eventually became the reason. I think the VA is pretty much on record as having said this is perhaps from as late as, I don't know. Let me see my notes here. I think in 2014 there was an Institute of Medicine report on um, regarding the possible case definition for Gulf War illness, and the recommendation of that committee was that it be called Gulf War illness, that they stop calling it chronic multi-symptom illness or other less descriptive terms. And we know because there was an email generated by a staffer at the Institute of Medicine where she reported, and where it was subsequently reported to the press, she reported to the committee that had created the report that the then, when they briefed the VA, the then Undersecretary for Benefits, who was Allison Hickey, said that, let me actually get the quote here because this is, she said that calling the illness Gulf War illness, and this is the quote, might, this is from the email, might imply a causal link between service in the Gulf and poor health, which could necessitate disability compensation. So by that time frame, which I would include up to the present, I think VA's attitudes are explained by essentially not wanting to spend the money. It's really a continuation of the denial that Agent Orange veterans in Vietnam experienced, that it took 20 years to recognize, to accept that their illnesses were related to Agent Orange. The burn pits veterans of the post 9/11 era have run into the same thing where the instinctive, or it's not instinctive, it's very conscious, the reaction of government officials at VA or DoD is to minimize these complaints, and I think that's a very stupid policy as well as being immoral. But that's what they have done. Now, if you go back into the history of the Gulf War illness, something else was going on there, and I don't know what it was, but it was from the denial began on the battlefield. Uh, we had there's a veteran who later became a member of the committee, who's Jim Bunker, whose commanding officer was John Gingrich, who later became chief of staff to Secretary Shinseki. And John, their unit was downwind of after the war. They were downwind from Basra, where Saddam Hussein was putting down a revolt with helicopters spreading nerve gas. And when they reported it up through channels, uh, John Gingrich was told by his higher ups that this had to be heat. This couldn't be any reaction to what was going on in Iraq. And he said, "Well, it was hotter in Kansas than it is here right now. I, I I know heat when I see it." But they were denying that there had been exposure to nerve gas right in the middle of the war or the immediate after effects. So this is well before VA would have been concerned about it, or VA would have had any role. So there was something much earlier, much higher up. If you speak with other people who were active at that time, I wasn't involved, as I said, until 10 years later. But the people who were involved at that time all have stories to tell of examples of where the White House or um, where um, senior figures at VA and DoD took attitudes that were not really explainable, other than that it was a continuation of a policy that started very early on. And maybe someday somebody who was part of that will tell the story of why there was such an immediate and high level denial, but there was.
And so you sort of already touched upon this, but do you want to expand why the Research Advisory Committee, that is the RAC, was constituted and/or how that came about?
Well, it happened because of the efforts of veterans lobbying Congress and and finding support in Congress. The history of Gulf War Health is one where uh, the executive branch, whether it has been under Republicans or Democrats, has more often than not been the bad guy, and Congress, whether it's been under Republicans or Democrats, has more often than not been the good guy. Um, there are exceptions to that on both sides, but the um, uh, the 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 in Congress, the veterans were unhappy, obviously, that they were not being uh, their health problems were not being recognized. They were being told that this was something that happened after every war, that it was psychosomatic, if anything, and so on. The Congress held hearings. The committee that specifically was responsible was a subcommittee of the House Veterans Affairs Committee, chaired by Congressman Christopher Shays, who was a Republican from Connecticut. And they held hearings for a long period of time, produced a very important document, which was the hearing record, and then afterwards um, proceeded to write this very detailed legislation, which covered many subjects. It covered benefits. There was to be a series of reviews by the Institute of Medicine that would examine whether the health problems of Gulf War veterans were associated with exposures that they had had during the war. This was the mechanism that had worked to eventually demonstrate that Agent Orange was, in fact, responsible for many of the health problems of Vietnam veterans. They created the Research Advisory Committee, or they mandated that it be appointed by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs. And it also created, as I said, this conference in Atlanta. But the Clinton administration just flat out disobeyed the law. They refused to appoint the committee. And so when it was appointed, it was after the election of a new president. And that new president was, um, I think I spoke with George W. Bush once during the campaign. I knew him from before, not well, but I knew him. And he was genuinely interested in this problem. And I know from what I heard that Ross Perot was extremely interested. And in effect, George W. owed Ross Perot a favor. And what Ross Perot wanted, his only favor was he wanted that committee appointed. And the person to appoint it was Tony Principi. And Tony was a good man. At a time when very few senior figures in Washington have their children experiencing the military. I believe that two of Tony Principi's sons served in the early phases of the post 9/11 wars, and he wanted to do the right thing. I saw that up close and personal.
And do you have knowledge on how the original members of the committee were selected?
Ross Perot named a couple of them. He had a couple of veterans that he wanted to be sure were on that committee. Steve Robinson was one of them, and mm, I'll think of the other guy's name in a little while. But they were both great members of the committee and people who'd been involved in this for a long time. Um, and what, as I said, I had been chosen at the beginning, and so there there was a guy named Jeff Phillips, who was a guy on Principi's staff who was actually putting it together, and um, I suggested a number of names of people that were appointed to the committee. I think I suggested your name, Beatrice, um, and there were also Jeff Phillips picked one guy himself. Uh, he Jeff had served in the war, and he knew that one of the lieutenants who had served under him had become ill, and he he put that guy on the committee because he wanted somebody that he kind of knew and trusted himself to be able to see if we were doing a good job.
And
His name was Joel Graves, by the way. These things are coming back to me now. That is the fellow who had served under Jeff Phillips.
and so you served as chairman of the RAC for about 15 years from its inception. In your work,
It wasn't quite 15 years. It might have seemed like 30 years, but it was actually 12.
okay, yeah, and so in your work, you not only oversaw actions of the committee, but also did a lot of behind the scenes work on the Hill on behalf of Gulf War veterans. So these two questions, we're just going to split up about these two roles. So you I believe worked with, or you with Lee Steele and Anthony Hardy worked tirelessly on the Hill. So, can you tell us something about those efforts?
Well, there were really two areas in which we worked with Congress. Um, the first was just to keep Congress informed. As I mentioned, the Research Advisory Committee, while it was appointed by the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, was mandated by Congress in this 1998 law. And so uh, I always felt that we had two parents, if you will. We were a VA committee, but we were also beholden to Congress. And uh, over the course of the time I was chairman, uh, there were 12 hearings by the House or the Senate on Gulf War illness, and we we did our best to stay in touch with. It was initially Congressman Shays and his committee, which included um, now Senator Bernie Sanders, uh, and also then Congressman Dennis Kucinich. They were among the the members of Congressman Shays' committee who it was a bipartisan effort to try to find out what had gone wrong here. And so I I would well, first of all, they asked me. I was asked to a meeting with Chris Shays and Bernie Sanders soon after the committee was appointed to, and they wanted to give me their input and uh, why they had created this committee and so on. So that was part of what we did with Congress, and the purpose of that, very frankly, was to continue to put pressure on the executive branch that. Um, we very quickly learned, I very quickly learned that my expectations that if you had, if you had the president, if you had the secretary, if you had the science, that things were going to go in the right direction. That was very naive. Uh, the 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 um, the VA has a very thin layer of political appointees at the top. Most of the jobs are held by career personnel, um, and these people included uh, many who had uh, come from the Clinton administration, who had been part of the efforts there to minimize this problem, and they had been put in the jobs they'd been put in to continue to do that. That was part of their mission, and it again. It was something I was totally unprepared for. I thought if you had the secretary of, of a department in favor of doing something, how could the people under him not follow his lead? And in fact, they were very much sabotaging what he was trying to do. But so educating and eventually we became this had been a public subject. The when the government would try to when there had been a lot of publicity in the 1990s that this was not a serious problem, and so we wanted to get congressional hearings to begin to show the evidence that it indeed was a serious, real medical problem. And the second the second reason we worked with Congress um, didn't evolve immediately, but as time went along, and as VA frankly didn't do much in terms of actually taking the research recommendations of the committee and translating them into actual research. At first, there were just some small efforts that came from Congress itself in the mid 2000s to put a little bit of money aside for research in the Department of Defense budget to study Gulf War health and to try to develop um, treatments for the problems the veterans were having. And uh, we discovered that this program was managed in a different way from what we had seen at VA or indeed at the main channels at DoD. This program was truly responsive to Congress. It was called the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Program. And if Congress said they wanted it handled in a certain way, it would be. And so uh, over time, uh, because this was outside of normal DoD channels, it required that each year uh, someone had to go to Congress and find sponsors in the House and in the Senate, ideally from both political parties, to um, to support this research program. And then it was necessary that the the committee that was looking at the DoD budget would have to add money for this research program if they wanted to have it continue. And so that became, uh, as you mentioned, a very, in hindsight, important part of what we did, and that was I learned how to lobby. I had not done that before. I was taught how to lobby by a veteran named Paul Sullivan, who had never served on the committee, but he was part of the group that got the legislation passed to create the committee. Paul introduced me to some of the congressional staff that he had worked with before who were still there and sort of taught me the ropes of how you get through the halls of Congress. And I of course, I always wanted to have veterans with me because there's nobody who can speak about Gulf War illness with 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 the force of a Gulf War veteran and who has it. And so Anthony was very much involved, became very much involved at that time, Anthony Hardy, and other veterans as well. Uh, the um, Denise Nichols is a Gulf War veteran who came to I think every research advisory committee we had as a public. She was not a member of the committee, but she was always there as a member of the public in the audience, and she would knock on doors, she would send emails, she would work very hard to try to make sure that not only did this letter get generated, but the key was to get a lot of other senators or congressmen to sign on to this letter. And the more you got, the better your chances were that your money would be added to the bill. And so I think if we were to look back at this point in time and say, well, what did or did not get accomplished by the Research Advisory Committee, that the two key things that we did accomplish were I think that the reports we published um, in there was an initial report, the very first meeting. There was another larger report in 2004. There was a very significant report, 452 pages in 2008, and the last one was in 2014. Those reports, I think, today are established within the scientific community as the basis for what is scientifically known about this problem. That it is not psychological, psychosomatic. That it is indeed a neurological problem brought about as a result of toxic exposures. The other accomplishment would be the the Gulf War Illness Research Program at the Congressionally Directed Medical Research Programs, which continues to this day, and which we managed to get funding from about $5 million the first year it was initiated to 20 million by, I believe, 2012. So over the period of the program, it's funded more than $200 million of research, much of which is still ongoing. And from the beginning, that research has been focused on treatments, on something that would actually improve the health of Gulf War veterans, as opposed to just confirming they were sick or some other subject. And we've had some minor successes. Again, I think the best success thus far has been thanks to your work, Beatrice, with CoQ10, of finding something that actually could improve the health of Gulf War veterans. But uh, I remain hopeful and optimistic that there could be some bigger breakthroughs in the future. But Lee was extremely helpful, Lee Steele, and she didn't actually do lobbying, but we were able to brief the members of Congress. It was usually a staffer rather than the member, but we would hold briefings where uh, she would typically be the main speaker in discussing what the problem was and what was being done to it for it, and what research we were hoping to sponsor. So that was the other major goal of working with Congress, and I'm very pleased to say that continues to up to the present. Um, I'm no longer involved. A, a, uh, a guy who's no longer chairman of anything, who's got gray hair like I do, is not somebody that a congressional staffer is going to pay a lot of attention to. But Gulf War veterans continue to run this and to work for it. And Anthony Hardy, I'll talk more about that later. But Anthony has just taken over and done so well at everything. He runs has for the last 6 years. He's run the lobbying effort, which has never been more successful. Last year they had 100 U.S. congressmen sign the letter. The amount that they are seeking funding for is going up. The In addition, he served as a patient member of the committee that decides where the money is invested and what kind of research is actually done. Uh, this CDMRP program is a totally above board, peer reviewed program, open to anyone. Any researcher can submit a proposal, and it's reviewed by two different committees. But the one that ultimately decides, and this is true for other illnesses that the CDMRP researches, they always have patients who suffer from the illness on the committee, just to keep the doctors and the scientists sort of really well informed. Well, Anthony served in that role for many years, and then he was actually asked to be the chair, which is unheard of, that you would ask a lay person, someone who didn't have an alphabet soup of letters after their names, to be the chair. But Anthony took this work so seriously that the CDMRP staff asked him to do it, and he chaired it for 5 years. So here you have a guy who has more or less single-handedly been doing the lobbying for it since 2014, and he's also been leading the committee that decides where the money is spent. And he's not well. Anthony is, even when he was on the committee in 2011, 12, if we had a full day's meeting, you couldn't expect to see Anthony that next morning. He couldn't work 2 days in a row. So I just cannot say enough about the work that he has done over the years to keep this thing going after I've ridden off into the sunset.
Do you have any heroes among those on the Hill?
Well, certainly Congressman Shays and then Congressman Sanders and then Congressman Kucinich and many. I don't know who the other members of that committee were. They were, but they were courageous people. They were willing to take on the federal government and say, "You're not doing the job here. We don't believe you." Um, and so, but for them, this would have been. And in the Senate, I think Senator Byrd was very influential, and I think that was because of a staff member who led this effort on his part, named Jim Toot. Uh, and I wish I knew the names of all the people who'd been involved in keeping this alive in the '90s, because that was when it was um, it it every effort was to sweep it under the rug. After we got involved at the Research Advisory Committee, um, in the Senate, certainly Senator Sanders has been a key sponsor of our letter there. Um, and in more recent years, Senator Tammy Baldwin and her office have led that effort. And again, Anthony Hardy at one time worked for Senator Baldwin. So you can trace a lot of this back to Anthony. In the House, uh, there have been a succession of committee chairs and subcommittee chairs of the House Veterans Affairs Committee uh, who collectively have kept this program alive. And in many years, while we might have had 75 signatures, 65 of them might have been Democrats, and the Republicans may have been in charge. But those 10 Republicans who were willing to sign the letter were often the most influential ones, in the sense that they were chairs of subcommittees of the House Veterans Affairs Committee or the committee chair itself. And so we can be deeply grateful for those people. One guy in particular who I remembered when I started thinking back on this uh, was a senior. He was the staff member for Congressman Kucinich for Veterans Affairs and Military Affairs, and eventually became the chief of staff to Congressman Kucinich. And his name is Vic Edgerton, and I think Vic is still on Capitol Hill. I'm not sure in what capacity, but it was Vic's efforts that we very early on in the CDMRP work, as I said, each year you had to go to Congress and ask them to renew the funding or to and increase the funding if you needed more money. And this was very early on when the program had been funded the previous year at $8 million. And there was some pressure to reduce the funding for CDMRP programs on the grounds that, yes, these diseases may be important diseases, but they really aren't military problems. They're diseases like breast cancer and prostate cancer and so on. And so in that particular year, which was back in the late 2000s when Congress was focused on cutting spending, they were going to cut the budget of all the CDMRP programs that didn't have anything to do with military work specifically. And they were going to cut them by, I think, 20%. And Gulf War illness was in that group. So it was going to be cut from 6 million or from 8 million to 6.75 or something like that. Well, you can't really run much of a research program with $6 million. And there were a few programs that they were the House uh, Defense Appropriations Subcommittee had said we should increase because these are really military programs. I can't remember what they were, but well, with Vic's strong, I mean, Vic was really the one who was saying, well, let's fight this. Let's not accept this. And instead of um, allowing Congress to reduce the funding to 6 million, let's say that Gulf War illness should be actually recognized as one of these areas that is um, it's essential. It's truly about warfighting because it's not just the veterans who've had these exposures. Someday on another battlefield, you're going to have uh, other soldiers subjected to these exposures, and if you don't know how to treat them, you're going to again run into the same terrible health problems for the rest of their lives. So Vic put together a an amendment, and Congressman Kucinich introduced it, uh, saying that instead of reducing the the Gulf War illness research budget from 8 to 6.75, that the budget should be increased to 25%, which is what these few other programs that the committee had said was really related to military service should have increases. And the chairman of the committee, uh, the, the Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, um, he was opposed to this, but um, Congressman Kucinich introduced it on the floor of the House, and there was a roll call vote. And this is when it was like 2011, perhaps. The Republicans had a sizable majority in the House. There was a roll call vote, and you had members actually go up to the chair and give their votes. And you saw the tally on, if you were watching on C-SPAN, the tally was up on the board. And 70 Republicans joined with most of the Democrats to to pass this amendment in the face of the opposition of the Republican committee chair. And so the the budget went from 8 to 10. And the next year, VA was by then um, retrenching on this subject. They had seemed to be coming along for a while, but for reasons that had to do with, you know, they were never fully invested, and they wanted to save some money. So they cut the Gulf War research budget at VA by $10 million from what it was supposed to have been that year. And again, Vic said, "Well, let's get that 10 back." And so he and I put together uh, an amendment, which was introduced on the floor by Congressman Kucinich, that took the 10 million that he had been able to get the year before and increased it to 20 on the grounds that the VA had cut Gulf War research by 10, so we were going to increase it by 10 at the Department of Defense. And one of the few most satisfying moments I've had in this work was the the same Republican chairman of the Defense Appropriations Committee stood up and said, "I don't often agree with my friend Mr. Kucinich." He probably never agreed with him before, but he remembered what happened last year, and he joined him in sponsoring this amendment. So that's how it got from 8 to 20, and 20 times, you know, now 8 years or so is a lot of money. and that money's being spent, and it's thanks to I should mention that the other thing about CDMRP is that they've been willing to put not only people like Anthony, but people who really understand the problem, like Lee Steele, like Roberta White, on the committee that makes the decisions. And those people have been able to educate the other people on the committees so that it, they have really funded good research. And with the money that's come from Congress, they've been able to get people from institutions like Harvard and Stanford and other places that never would have researched Gulf War health problems in the past. And and they developed some very innovative approaches of researching in what they've called consortia, where they'll encourage researchers to submit proposals that are grouped together, where they have a team goal and a team effort. And so um, that that's that would never have happened but for Vic Edgerton.
Other than what you've already previously mentioned, did you have any other reflections about working with the committee?
Let me see. Well, it was a real education in. I had worked in Washington before, as I mentioned, at the Pentagon, but and it was Washington is a tough business. I mean, they people are always willing to fight hard for what they want, and sometimes behind the scenes and so on. But I always had a lot of respect for the people at the Pentagon and in the other agencies. This was during the Reagan administration. They were dealing with facts, and they might have worked hard at advocating their positions, but it was all you were there was nobody being dishonest, nobody and whereas this entire um, experience of working with people at VA, you knew that a lot of them wanted to probably do the right thing, but that there was a policy, there were that was not what they were being paid to do, and um, so it was discouraging to sort of realize how an organization that you would have thought should be very dedicated, very above reproach, um, could engage in uh, not just opposing something, but out and out dishonesty. The relationship between the VA and the National Academy of Sciences. Uh, we eventually produced reports on that subject. National Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine is the one of the most respected institutions in America. It's the Institute of Medicine. To be elected a member of that, it's now called the National Academy of Medicine. It is the highest honor anyone in American medical science can aspire to. And even among the people on my committee, it was unheard of, they couldn't believe that the Institute of Medicine would steer a report and its conclusions in a way to satisfy a client, which the client being the Department of Veterans Affairs. But eventually, we there were hearings held, and we got correspondence between VA and the Institute of Medicine, and it clearly did happen, and it continued to happen. And so we ended up, fighting those kinds of battles and proving, arguing that this or that person shouldn't be on this new committee that the Institute of Medicine was setting up because he or she had worked in the past uh, uh, for an organization that clearly supported the VA's historical position, or maybe even worked for the VA in the past. And so much effort had to be spent on fighting these battles over, just admitting that there's a problem. If these people had only from the beginning, and I don't really fault the people down in the trenches. They're Although I do respect the ones who took a stand. I mean, the ones who were willing to risk their careers and say the truth. You thank God for them. People like you, Beatrice. People like Bobby White, um, Robert Haley. It takes tremendous courage to stand up and say what's truthful. Um, you know, if I had been in a job where I was, it was my family's, uh, it was the paycheck I was earning, and so on. It would have been. I mean, I was a volunteer, and if I got fired, it didn't matter to me. Um, so, but very few people have that. Um, are lucky enough to be in that position, and it's I really admire those who were willing to stick their necks out when it did mean a lot, and challenge. Speaking truth to power is a nice phrase, but it's not something that happens often enough.
What was your experience like working with the veterans?
That was certainly one of the uh, kind of best aspects of this for me. I've been terribly disappointed that we didn't do that the science has proved so difficult, and that where we have been able to get good research, mostly at the CDMRP program, it's taking so long to get something that makes a difference to these people's health. Um, but the veterans themselves who have hung in there and continued to work not just for themselves but for their fellow veterans are truly heroes. And I've mentioned Anthony, I've mentioned Steve Robinson, who Steve is died a number of years ago of complications to his health due to Gulf War research. Paul Sullivan has been, while he was never a member of the Research Advisory Committee, he has been a huge contributor and leader in this effort over the years, and continues to to be an extremely influential person in Washington. And now that we have a new president whose son, whom he believes his son, uh, developed cancer as a result of his exposure to burn pits. Um, this could be a very significant change in policy with respect to um, not just burn pits, but Gulf War exposures. Um, Having someone in the White House who knows that toxic exposures can cause very serious health problems to um, American servicemen and women is we've never had that before. And I know that some of the veterans I've mentioned, Paul and Anthony, are working hard to try to ensure that the evidence that we have, and many of the issues are the same, where the Institute of Medicine or the National Academy of Medicine now have been asked to review research and determine if the health problems of post 9/11 veterans are related to burn pits, and the results have been the same as they have for Gulf War veterans, where uh, the committees invariably find there's not enough evidence. But it's because of the rules the committees are following, which are not the rules Congress actually specified for them. And I think we're we've got a winning argument here, and we may have somebody in the White House now who will listen to that argument. Uh, Unfortunately, that while that could have an effect on benefits, um, one of the things I've learned from veterans is that benefits is not really. I mean, they want them if that's the only alternative. If someone's a widow, she wants her husband what her husband was supposed to have, but well, they want their health. They're like anybody else. They want to have their health back, and that's what we should still be working toward. Um, the uh, we set aside a half hour every day, every time we would meet. Every day of that meeting, we would have a half hour at the end of the day where uh, members of the audience, who were largely Gulf War veterans, could speak on whatever subject they wanted to bring before the committee. And because we were the only public committee that dealt with Gulf War health issues, except for a short period of time when there was another one that dealt with uh, benefits and care, we were supposedly just dealing with research. But because we were the only game in town, we would hear about the experiences that veterans had in the VA system, uh, with care and with benefits. And um, I'm uh, one other veteran who came to almost every meeting for many years was a fellow named Kurt Love. And um, Kurt is very angry, and justifiably so. I think if you were to ask the majority of veterans who have been ill and who have gone through what all of these people have gone through with their health and with the lack of benefits and with frustrations in dealing with doctors at VA, uh, they would be angry. And Kurt always represented, I think, that position uh, extremely well. Um, the there were always 4 to 5 veterans who served on the committee, and they were extremely helpful in their contributions. They could tell a scientist, well, that issue that you just brought up, that's not really a problem for us, or the real problem is over here. This is what we need help with. And so uh, it's been, I think if whenever we would produce a report, we were just telling the world with a lot of scientific footnotes what veterans had known all along. And it's tragic that when all these veterans, they weren't veterans at that time, all these servicemen and women came home from the Gulf War and they said they were feeling badly. It's tragic that the powers that be did not immediately jump on top of this and say, what is wrong? We need to find out the truth here and address it. And I think I honestly believe that if you had if if they had begun working at that time, which was, roughly 20 years before the CDMRP program got going, 10 years before the RAC got appointed, uh, you would have treatments today that would make a much bigger difference to their health.
Similarly, I guess what were your experiences working with the scientists?
The well, there are two kinds. There are the scientists who who were the type of scientists that served on the research advisory committee, and we were very fortunate to have a committee of dedicated people. These people were rigorous. I, we've mentioned Lee Steele a couple of times. Lee was a huge contributor to what um, the work we did, and I mean it was her full time job for 5 years to be a member of the committee and its scientific director. That's all she did. She organized every meeting. She brought in all of the scientists that spoke to us, and first foremost, she wrote a 452-page book that has become justifiably the Bible of what anyone knows about Gulf War illness and Gulf War health. And she did it with total um, uh, scientific accuracy. She was rigorous. She would not let me, I would run my statements before Congress say by her, and she would change a word, or she would say you can't say that, you can say this, and she would always keep us very much in a completely scientifically solid defensible position. And that was critical, because had you had people on all sides waiting to snipe at you and take anything you did apart if we had gone another way. um, so uh, the scientists on the committee were, I mean, each person contributed uh, from his or her expertise, but they were dedicated. We had 3 meetings a year, usually 2.5 day meetings. People showed up. People would prepare. If and those of us who were in leadership positions, Beatrice was the scientific director at the beginning. She knows that. I mean, there was a tremendous amount of preparation and willingness to testify to Congress, to talk to the media, to um, to do all the pieces of this job that you, in an ideal world, wouldn't have been necessary to do. In an ideal world, the government would have said, "This is a problem. We need to hire the best people, and let's go research this and find out what's wrong and find out what we can do about it." And instead, all of us had become experts in everything about working with Congress, working with the media. Um, but the scientists uh, were fantastic, and many of them continue to research and devote their lives to studying this problem. Uh, the One of the good things about the congressionally directed medical research program is that it has brought in a great deal of new blood and new researchers, but many of the people who've been doing this since the 90s, like Dr. Golomb, uh, have continued to apply for research studies that continue to advance what's known. So those people have sort of been examples of the best that is in us as scientists and researchers. On the other hand, we worked with a lot of uh, a lot of people at VA, and I should distinguish between we were not seeing the field people at VA. I think that the doctors and nurses in the field, um, some of them are, they've been taught the wrong stuff, and so they're not good in addressing these problems. But there are a lot of doctors and nurses in the field who are there for the right reasons because they want to help veterans. The people in Washington, um, they're it has to have been very. Uh, I mean, and yeah, on a few occasions, it seemed like we were going to make a breakthrough, and you could kind of see that these people were happier. they they really wanted to do the right thing. Some of them, but others, they're just kind of bureaucrats. They've they've they don't care anymore whether something is true or false, and we've obviously seen that in spades. Uh, that's a big problem in our country now, and this was well before any of the current players became involved. So it's been around before that, but um, I one thing that I will say is that anytime an actual working group was formed and scientists from the research advisory committee served on it along with neutral parties from the outside, people who were appointed and didn't really know much about this stuff. They were serious scientists, but they weren't expert in Gulf War. Invariably, the research advisory committee scientists and veterans would win them over. These outsiders, these third parties, would learn that what they were being told by the RAC scientists and the RAC veterans was the truth, and it was solid science. And that's why the CDFRP program has evolved so well over the years, because while it's had some people on the committee there who come from the research advisory committee background, the majority of them do not, but they they have learned, they've been taught what they need to know, and they've seen that is the solid science from the people who've been on the rack. And that happened for a while at VA. There was a period where the then chief research and development officer, Joel, I'll think of Joel's last name in a minute, but he brought in an outside guy, and he was from Texas, very solid background, and he kind of looked at both sides of things, and eventually came down pretty much where the rack was in terms of what VA needed to do. And for a while, VA started down that path, but then I think it was a financial consideration that made them decide they weren't gonna open up the benefits they would have to pay if the true extent of Gulf War illness were recognized. I mean, even today, there's been a GAO study recently, and over 80% of Gulf War illness type claims are denied. Should never happen.
So did you want to further expand upon like the experience working with the VA?
Hmm. Well, it was great at the beginning, even though there were these carryover people that were working behind the scenes to ignore what we were coming up with and what the secretary wanted. Um, the uh, the secretary was fabulous. Tony Principi, he would answer my emails the same day. Um, he was a he cared about this subject, and he made it a priority. Um, and that was in hindsight, now that I realize what the norm is, um, I appreciate it even more than I probably did at the time. Uh, and and he did some important things. I don't know if anybody today will remember, because it's now been changed by subsequent over the last 6 years. But uh, Tony, in 2004, at the end of when we produced our 2004 report, he determined and ordered that VA would not in the future sponsor any Gulf War health research based on the assumption that Gulf War illness was a psychiatric or psychological problem. Uh, and that was a huge step forward. Um, and unfortunately, they once Tony was gone, you had a series of um, secretaries who they just weren't as invested in this subject as he had been, and as a result, the people down in the ranks had uh, were able to operate, and they were not supportive of what we wanted to do until, I should mention, talking about VA. Uh, when Secretary Shinseki became secretary with the election of President Obama, he appointed as his chief of staff a man named John Gingrich. And John had been a battalion commander during the Gulf War. And as I mentioned earlier, he was the commander of a battalion that had I think gone through Kuwait, perhaps, or at least was on the boundaries between Kuwait and Iraq, and was subject to exposure to some nerve gas that blew downwind from Basra, where Saddam Hussein was putting down a rebellion. And he had to medevac one of his officers to Germany for nerve gas exposure. He knew completely that this was a serious problem, and that it was, as I mentioned earlier, not caused by the heat. And so in Colonel Gingrich, we had someone in the secretary's office, I mean, at the highest level, who believed in this as a problem, and he undertook a number of attempts to reform the VA system, and he also got us a hearing at the Institute of Medicine. There was kind of a tradition that had developed where we would produce a report, and then the VA staff would go to the Institute of Medicine and order a report that undercut our report. And so when the VA staff did that following our 2008 report, I talked to John Gingrich, and he made sure that we were invited. This was with the secretary's support, but it was John who caused it to happen. We were invited to the Institute of Medicine's meeting, and I said I wasn't going to go myself just for show here. I would only go if they would invite scientists from our committee, and that we had a full amount of time to present our findings. And so uh, Dr. Steele was the main person who represented us at that scientifically, and I represented us otherwise. And as a result, that that Institute of Medicine report agreed with us more than it agreed with the traditional opinions of the government. It agreed that uh, Gulf War, didn't call it Gulf War illness, but chronic multi-symptom illness, parenthesis Gulf War illness, was associated with Gulf War service, that it was not psychiatric, and in many other ways, it agreed with our 2008 report. Probably one of the most significant things it did was to advocate that a serious research effort be launched, and that it was that treatments and preventive measures could still be found. And it was that language which we were able to use with Congress to get them to fund the CDMRP program, because it showed that the highest authorities in American medicine believed that. So that was due to John Gingrich getting us in front of those people. Eventually, Secretary Shinseki and John Gingrich both ran afoul of well, not so much policies, but you know, just having to take responsibility for things that were going on at VA that in many cases they weren't even aware of. You'll remember that Secretary Shinseki ultimately had to resign after the scandal in Phoenix at the VA, and his sort of farewell press conference, he said something to the effect of that in all his time in the military, and he rose to be Army Chief of Staff, I believe. That was he was a very senior military figure. He said, "I was never lied to by my people," and it, frankly, by then, it not only didn't surprise me, but I knew it for a fact that his people did lie all the time. So you have good people trying to work the system at places like VA, um, and it uh, I don't I've been out of there for 6 years now, so I couldn't tell you what the prospects are right now.
Obviously, you, Lee, and Anthony were particularly important and unquestionably heroes in this domain. Did you want to talk about the contributions of Lee and Anthony or others that were involved?
Well, I think I've already covered that. Um, there was both Lee and Anthony. I think I mentioned Dr. Golomb certainly as the first um, scientific director of the RAC. She got us off on the right start. She always was the most creative person, I would say, and she, I think in understanding a problem like Gulf War illness, you need people who think outside the box, but well, who have not just inventing things, but who can put things together. I was I came to respect um, scientists who were willing to be creative, because I didn't realize coming into this how fundamentally conservative medical science is. It's not easy to buck what the establishment tells you, even when they're wrong. Um, Dr. White, Roberta White, was another pioneer. She was actually working in VA in the 90s, and she uh, took an assignment to find out what was wrong with these people and discovered that they didn't have a psychiatric problem. They had a physiological problems, and that actually, for a short amount of time, had some influence within VA, but not a very long time. And eventually, she left VA. She became the third scientific director and did a fabulous job in putting together the reports after the 2008 report, and also getting a very important article published in Cortex, which I know is cited quite regularly by people doing research in the area now. Um, and um, she again has been, one of the huge leaders in keeping the CDMRP program on track. She continued to serve on the committee even after Anthony became the chairman. She had been the chairman before, and that way she was, he she could support him if he needed it. And to this day, the people that she brought into the program, people like Kim Sullivan. Dr. Sullivan is at Boston University. She was actually the full time day to day person who worked and ran the committee staff during the years that Bobby was the scientific director. Um, she, continued Lee Steele's traditions of bringing in very good speakers, of exposing the problem and finding creative new ways to look at it, and went on to become chairman of one of the two consortia that were funded by CDMRP to bring scientists from different backgrounds, different institutions together to study Gulf War illness. And those two consortia are now merged in a single consortia, and she continues to, I'm sure, pretty much work full time on the problems of Gulf War veterans. Dr. Nancy Klimas was the chair of the other consortia, and she has a background not only in research of these kinds of multi-symptom illnesses, but she has a great clinical background treating first people with uh, um, CFS, chronic fatigue syndrome, and more recently Gulf War illness. And I really admire, again, these scientists who have devoted their entire careers to researching these unpopular illnesses that have been career killers for a lot of people, but whom they have managed to not only build a career in, but to keep the hopes of hundreds of thousands of patients alive, that there will be somebody cares about them, somebody wants to do things for them, and eventually they will do things for them. Another person who served on the committee who played a tremendously important role was Jim O'Callahan. Dr. O'Callahan, during the time he was on the committee, was head of the CDC's, not sure exactly what they called it, but their neurotoxicology research program, doing mainly animal research at their lab in West Virginia. Jim brought that entire dimension of animal research and how that can lead to and benefit human problems to the program, and just running a CDC lab and being extremely respected in scientific circles in the neurotoxicology world. Jim added a lot of credibility to our efforts. Um, Floyd Bloom, uh, Dr. Bloom was certainly the most revered and respected person who ever served on the committee. He's more than once we would have an outside speaker pause at the beginning to say what an honor it was to speak to a group, including Dr. Bloom as the father of modern neuroscience. Um, Again, Floyd gave us tremendous advice. He was as active a participant as anyone, um, and he was always very good at not falling into kind of a group think. He wasn't beyond disagreeing with other members of the committee when he thought we were off base or they were off base, but always in a respectful way and always in a very scientifically sound way. Um, we were never amiss taking his advice, and he also was a very respected member of the Institute of Medicine. Knew the senior figures there, and um, I think he helped give stature to our positions with the Institute of Medicine, and the, most Gulf War Institute of Medicine reports have, as I said, reflected the fact that they were written for a client, which was the VA at that time. But a couple of them, I mentioned one earlier, a couple of them have done some real good. And one of those was the report which spoke about case definitions for Gulf War illness and which recommended the use of the term Gulf War illness. And that was a committee that Floyd Bloom served on. And I'm sure that while we weren't in the room when the committee was holding its deliberations, I'm sure that he's responsible for the content of that report. Another person who was a member of the committee for many years and who has devoted a huge part of his life to Gulf War veterans is Robert Haley. And I admire greatly the courage that he showed to, take on the entire world in terms of publicity and stick his neck out there and go on television in the 1990s when this was, that was just asking to be shot at. And Robert is another figure that I'm sure Gulf War veterans have tremendous reason to be thankful for. I think I've already talked about the veterans that, and there are many, many more, both scientists and veterans, that deserve tremendous credit for what they've done. Even with them, you can. It doesn't take a very long list to make up the people who have devoted more than lip service to this over the last couple of decades. And without that relatively small group of people, this would have disappeared beneath the oceans without a trace. It's still, the jury's still out as to whether we will make a significant change in the health of Gulf War veterans. I would like to think that 50 years from now, neurological problems will be akin to what heart problems are today. Um, where if you have a problem, there's generally speaking something you can do about it. But we're certainly still in the early stages of this today, and I think um, health problems due to toxic exposures are recognized as being part of that group um, only because of the work of the people who've been involved in Gulf War illness over the years.
And we, again, have sort of addressed this previously, but were there other heroes on the Democratic and Republican sides for this issue?
I think I've talked about most of them. One fellow that um, I also remember, he was the the chief of the staff of the House Veterans Affairs Committee. Um, I don't remember which subcommittee it was. Might have been Oversight and Investigations. His name was Eric Hannell, and Eric was himself a Gulf War veteran, and he he cared about these problems. He had friends who were ill. He had a good relationship with Jeff Miller, who was the Republican congressman who chaired the House Veterans Affairs Committee at that time, uh, and I, I'm sure that it's Eric whom we should thank that we got Jeff Miller to sign that letter every year, and Eric put on some very good hearings, um, and it it's these folks behind the scene in Washington that sometimes can make things happen or not happen, and for a number of years, Eric contributed a lot. Um, I think otherwise, I've already touched on the people that again I'm not mentioning more than I'm mentioning. There were a lot more, but these are the people who really stood out.
Yeah. Besides what has already been raised, can you recall other obstacles that you've encountered?
Well, I can almost say what obstacle didn't we encounter? um, it As I said, I knew from having worked in the Pentagon that Washington was a tough place, but I was not at all prepared for institutions, both inside and outside of government. The VA, the Institute of Medicine. I wasn't at all prepared for them to be. I don't know if corrupt is the term. It implies that somebody was getting a big paycheck. I'm not sure that was always the case, but just the dishonesty. The positive, I guess, would be that I think if you were to ask a neuroscientist at a major United States medical institution, university, what kind of problem Gulf War veterans have, they would tell you they have problems, that they're major problems, and that they are due to toxic exposures.
Other lessons that you felt you learned from your involvement in this issue?
Mm. Well, it certainly gave me a reason to get up in the morning every morning for all those years, and it was a very humbling experience. I mean, I wasn't a scientist. I didn't have the disease. Um, a lot of people had a lot more stake in the game than I did, and yet um, um, I'd worked. You'd asked at the beginning, what kinds of things had you done before? I mean, I was very fortunate. As I said, to sort of be there at the creation of the use of ultrasound obstetrics, um, and I was literally in the room when some of these leading doctors would use it for the first time and see, wow, oh, the baby's facing this direction, not that direction, the way I thought it was, and the way people had thought it was for 10,000 years before. Um, but that would have happened without me. I mean, I was lucky just to be there. And working with the veterans, as I said, these were mostly enlisted people. Denise was an officer, but Anthony was enlisted. I think every one of the guys except Joel Graves. Joel Graves was a lieutenant, but there are no generals in this, and yet these are the people who made it their life's work to try to get answers and get something done. And the scientists like Beatrice and Bobby and Lee, Robert, Jim, Floyd, all these people who were willing to stick their necks out. That just, I feel very lucky to have gotten to spend the sort of last chapter of my work life working with people like that on an issue where we had the high ground. We still have the high ground.
As the evidence evolved, did attitudes at the VA evolve with the evidence? And if not, do you have any hypotheses about why they didn't?
During that short period in 2008 to 2010, they evolved when the evidence started coming out of the mouths of the Institute of Medicine, and they evolved because John Gingrich was the chief of staff, and he knew before he ever read it from the Institute of Medicine that it was correct. But then it changed. We know secondhand that what caused them to back off, they were headed down a path which was likely going to end with them recognizing that instead of denying 80% of these claims, they should be approving 95% of these claims. And that was right after VA had done two things. One was they had expanded tremendously the number of illnesses that you could be compensated for on the grounds of Agent Orange if you were a Vietnam veteran. And that brought, I think the figure the VA used was 250,000 veterans into the system at one time in the 2011-ish timeframe. And we heard secondhand that having taken in so many people and being under criticism from the public and from Congress for being behind on processing claims, This was before the scandals of the claims in Phoenix, where they were manipulating the numbers and so on. This was just when the numbers were real, they were just behind. They apparently made the decision, and I don't know who they is, somebody at VA senior level, um, perhaps with the secretary's approval, perhaps they lied to the secretary. I don't know, but they decided that they would not. They would reverse course on Gulf War veterans, and the last thing they needed was 250,000 more sick veterans coming into the system and looking for claims. Um, and that's when the people who had been involved in promoting these psychiatric theories, these theories that this is nothing more than what happens after every war, who seem to be fading into the background. They were brought back into the picture and given the keys to the car, and eventually that resulted in when we had to start to take some very strong positions against what VA was doing when they were trying to reverse field. And the reason we did that, you asked about this, Beatrice. You mentioned that we took a public position in a research advisory committee saying we had no confidence in VA and detailed why, and I forget how many pages, but I think it was probably 30, specifying all the things that they were doing which were incorrect or dishonest or both. And the reason that I felt it was important to do that was that all of us on the committee, were living on borrowed time. All of our terms had expired. VA just hadn't reappointed us, and they hadn't appointed anybody new. And so all they needed to do was to just declare our terms up and appoint whomever they want, and we would have been gone. And I didn't want us to disappear without a trace. I expected that they would do that, which they did a couple of years later. But by that time, it was on the record, and there had been congressional hearings, and there had been another report, and so on, to establish that our version of science was correct and that their version of science was mythology.
So regarding the no confidence in the VA that you brought up, what happened to the RAC after that occurred?
Well, for a couple of years, we managed to sort of stay in position. They didn't immediately. As I said, the change in VA policy happened well before. It was happening before we called them out on it. That's what we called them out for, and we had about another, I don't know, year and a half, as I said, of preparing a major report. We testified to Congress. We continued to do what we were doing, but eventually John Gingrich had to resign. He resigned to take the heat for Secretary Shinseki on matters unrelated to Gulf War. And so without John Gingrich there, it took them perhaps a month before the staff, I'm sure they had a big powwow where they must have come in and grabbed the new chief of staff and said, "You won't believe we have this committee that's doing nothing but criticizing us." And so that was when they began to revise the committee charter. Secretary Shinseki was he was not a very active secretary. I think he let his staff take care of things. So I don't think he personally may have been that engaged in this, but his new chief of staff um, changed our charter, um, and I we fought back over the course of about a year, and actually had a bill go through the House that would have not allowed VA to do what it was doing, but it didn't go through the Senate. So eventually, um, VA replaced many of us on the committee, um, and that wasn't really the issue. I mean, I certainly never expected to serve 12 years when I signed up for the committee, but and to some extent, they actually put uh, a couple of good people on the committee and kept some people who were there from before. Uh, we had been successful in that period of time in making the case that the people they were planning to put on were biased in the wrong direction, and so they were careful to put some good people on, including the new chairman, um, who's a fellow named Stephen Hauser, who was head of neurology at the University of California, San Francisco. Extremely well qualified guy, much more qualified than me to hold the job. But what they had done was totally sort of gutted the committee of its power. Its charter had been changed. Um, it was no longer chartered to review VA's activities, and it was um, there's never been a congressional hearing since then. If there was, you can bet that the chairman of the committee would have to run his testimony by VA officials to get it signed off. Well, it had no independent staff. The staff subsequent to that time has been VA staff, and again, from the beginning, one of the things I asked Secretary Principi for was that the committee have its own staff, so that we knew we were in an adversarial position with respect to VA. We were asking if they were doing their job right and preparing reports on whether they were or not. And so we needed our own staff to do that. And that's where, they took that away. So the committee since 2014, when I and a number of others left it, and when they had changed the charter and took away the staff, it's just like any other VA committee. They come in and meet, and they may prepare a report, but they don't really have any independent basis for action. They have no connection to Congress, no connection to the media.
As we reach the end of this interview, I wanted to ask, what message would you like to convey to the VA?
Well, I actually gave them this message in one of the meetings in that last year, where we were pretty much fighting back and forth, that that's even if you accepted the notion that that the VA is somehow supposed to keep costs under control, and that's a legitimate objective. the way that the government has responded over the years to first Agent Orange and second Gulf War exposures, and more recently the toxic exposures associated with burn pits is is very bad policy. That what they've done is to, the veterans say, deny, deny until we die. They basically use every mechanism at their command to minimize these problems and to kick the can down the road. And coming into this job, I naively thought that scientific research was science. It was valid. Well, it's garbage in, garbage out. It's how you design any study. You can get any result you want depending on how you design the study. And all too often, that's what has happened in all of these areas of toxic exposure. They've been designing the studies to show that there isn't a problem instead of to show what the problem is. And as a result, what happens if you look at Agent Orange is this works, if you want to say that that's working, for a while, a long while. And for 20 years, in the case of the Vietnam veterans, the government maintained that Agent Orange hadn't caused any particular health problems and they didn't pay any benefits and so on. Well, then at that time, the Institute of Medicine, working with the support of Congress, said, oh, but over here, it has been shown. So they start to pay out benefits to those veterans. And then over time, more and more illnesses are added to the list. More and more veterans are added. And it's too late now, by then, to find out who actually was exposed to Agent Orange. So everybody gets covered. If you were in Vietnam, I say everybody, there have been issues over what if you were in a naval ship off the coast? What if you were in an airplane? Things like that. But you end up having lost the opportunity to distinguish between somebody who was there and got sick because he was there and somebody who got sick anyway. So problems like prostate cancer, which a high percentage of men my age would have a risk of anyway. If I had prostate cancer, I could get compensation for Agent Orange. And so the government ends up paying for these problems, sometimes overpaying eventually. And meanwhile, have they helped the veterans? No, not one bit. They've made the veterans' health worse for 20 years, 25 years, 30 years, whatever it is now for Gulf War veterans. They have denied that they have a problem, and instead of going out and from day one doing what they should do, which is to say, oh, we got a bunch of people who are sick coming back from this mission. We don't understand it very well. Admit we don't, but let's take it on. Let's figure out. The mission continues. Now the mission is our mission to figure out what's wrong and how do we fix it. And again, I believe what the Institute of Medicine report in 2010 said, that if you put the right people on this and you give them adequate funding, that these are soluble problems. This is not an impossible dream to think that you could improve the health of Gulf War veterans who are ill due to toxic exposures. And had they done that in 1991, we would be 20 years ahead of where we are today. And I submit that we would be there. And that would be a much more satisfying position if I were the VA to be in. And that if I worked at VA, I would feel much better about myself and about my country and my job. And I certainly would be doing a lot more for veterans. That's what I tell them.
Thank you for that. And I guess likewise, do you have a message for our government?
Well, I'm as I said earlier, I'm somewhat hopeful. I'm an optimist, or I wouldn't have stuck around this long. Um, and I'm hopeful that um, President Biden, he's on the record. He's given numerous media interviews in which he stated that he believes his son Bo, his cancer originated because of being stationed near burn pits, and he's in those interviews he indicates he's under the impression that there's that the science doesn't show that yet, but he thinks that's true. Well, the reason he says the science hasn't shown that yet is that there have been studies by the National Academy of Sciences, commissioned by VA, that conclude that there's not sufficient evidence that exposures to burn pits caused health problems. And the most recent one of these just came out in September. It was a study by the National Academy of Sciences, and the chairman of that study went out of his way to say, this doesn't mean it didn't cause it. It just means we don't have enough evidence that it caused it. Well, all you have to do is look at the standard of evidence that they use. And Congress set up what the standard was supposed to be back in 1998. It's very clear that they were supposed to look at both human and animal evidence. Well, what does that mean? Well, when you're studying toxic exposures, generally speaking, you're studying it in animals. It's not ethical to put a bunch of people in a room and just expose them to some terrible toxin. And for that reason, the vast majority of scientific studies of toxic substances are done in animals. The occasional study that is done in humans is it's because some terrible accident has occurred, and by definition, you're coming in after the fact. You're not nearly as controlled an environment, and so you may or may not be able to study the subject very well. And in many cases, you can't study it at all. And so, if that is what over the years has been done by uh, committee after committee of the Institute of Medicine, National Academy of Sciences, when looking at Gulf War health, they look at something like low level exposure to nerve gas, and they say, gee, when we expose animals to low levels of nerve gas, we can show that they have all sorts of long-term neurotoxic effects. But then they get to the end of the report and they say, oh, but we're only allowed to look at human studies. And there aren't any human studies about this. So our conclusion is, based on the evidence we're allowed to consider, we can't find evidence. And this is what has happened to the burn pits veterans as well. So I think that if somebody takes a hard look at this on behalf of the new president, we may get a real breakthrough in understanding the effects of toxic exposures on American veterans. And I certainly hope so.
And what message would you like to convey to the veterans?
Yeah. I certainly wish that we had been more effective in getting this government to do the right thing. And I hope almost as much as you do that in the long run, they do finally find some effective treatments.
Finally, what message would you like to give to posterity?
I think it's somewhere in the middle of all the stuff I've already said.
Yeah. Um, so I guess before we conclude, was there or is there anything that you would like to add that we maybe didn't cover or address?
No, no.
All right, yeah, no worries. I just wanted
Thank you guys for your interest in this.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to participate in this interview. We just want you to know like how much we appreciate this and your willingness to share your experiences and stories with us. It's very beneficial.
Jim, I also want to add my personal thanks. To me, you are, outside of the veterans, the greatest hero on the Gulf War illness issue. And I am the antithesis of a follower. But I've said to many people that, where you led, I would always be happy to follow. So thank you for everything you've done on this issue.
Well, thank you for putting me on the right course, Beatrice.
So, and thank you for the gift of your time on this interview as well, Jim.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was really nice to hear about everything for me personally as well. I really loved it. Thank you.
Okay.
All
Thank you,
right.
guys.